Hey guys, today's video tells the story of how a passionate note from Napoleon could have changed an entire war. Incredible, but true. If you like stories like this, give it a like and subscribe. It really helps the channel grow. And don't forget to tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. It's my favorite way to see who's here with us. Get comfortable, let the hum of your fan lull you, and let's dive in. The letter that changed a war memoirs of Colonel Charles de Lacroix, recorded at the Saint-Germain estate, October 1847. Now, when my hands tremble more from age than they once did from fear of grape shot, I understand. There are moments that determine not only the fates of individual men, but of entire nations. One such moment I witnessed with my own eyes in October 1805, just days before Austerlitz. Then I served as a major in the Emperor's staff, and my duty was to be a shadow, invisible, yet always ready to carry out any command. Memory works strangely. I can forget what I ate for breakfast yesterday, but I still remember the texture of the paper of that letter, which altered the course of our campaign against Austria. It was thick, cream-colored paper with the faint scent of lavender, Josephine's signature touch. The kind of paper that whispered of Paris salons and silk curtains, so foreign to our world of muddy boots and gunpowder. The Austrian campaign of 1805 had begun like clockwork. Napoleon's Grande Armée swept eastward with the precision of a Swiss timepiece, each corps moving according to the master's grand design. By early October, we had crossed the Rhine and were pushing deep into enemy territory. The Emperor's strategy was brilliant in its simplicity. Strike fast, strike hard, and catch the Austrians before they could unite with their Russian allies. Every day counted. Every hour mattered. I had been with Napoleon since the Italian campaigns, close enough to observe the man behind the legend. He was smaller than most imagined, yet when he entered a room, the very air seemed to shift. His eyes, those pale grey eyes that could pierce through excuses and see straight to the heart of any problem. But in those October days of 1805, I noticed something different about him. He would pause sometimes in the middle of dictating orders, his gaze drifting to the distance as if seeing something beyond the maps and dispatch reports that covered his campaign table. The letter arrived on October 12th, brought by a courier who had ridden hard from Paris. His horse was lathered with foam and mud, the man himself swaying in his saddle from exhaustion. But the sealed packet he carried bore Josephine's distinctive handwriting, and we all knew such deliveries took precedence over everything else. I was present when Napoleon broke the wax seal, a privilege that came with my position as his aide-de-camp. The tent was lit by a single oil lamp that cast dancing shadows on the canvas walls. Outside, we could hear the distant sounds of the army settling for the night. Horses snorting, men talking quietly around their fires, the occasional bark of orders from sergeants ensuring proper watch rotations. The Emperor read in silence, his face revealing nothing at first. Then something shifted. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and his left hand, the one not holding the letter, clenched into a fist. For a man who had faced Austrian cannons at Rivoli and Egyptian cavalry at the pyramids without blinking, he seemed suddenly vulnerable. What was in that letter? I would not learn the full contents until years later, when age and wine loosened tongues that had once been bound by imperial secrecy. But I knew immediately it contained more than mere expressions of wifely affection. Joséphine wrote of her loneliness, yes, but also of whispered rumors in Paris salons. Names were mentioned. Men who visited her soirees perhaps too frequently, who lingered too long after other guests had departed. The letter painted no explicit accusations, but its implications hung in the air like morning mist over a battlefield. Napoleon set the letter down with unusual care, as if it were made of glass. Then, he did something I had never seen him do before. He asked me to leave. Not dismissed me with his usual brusque efficiency, but actually requested that I give him privacy. The way he said it, almost as if asking a favor rather than giving an order, stays with me still. I withdrew to the outer section of the tent, but walls of canvas are poor barriers to sound. I heard the scrape of his chair, the rustle of maps being moved, then the scratch of his pen on paper. He wrote for nearly 2 hours, stopping occasionally to pace the small confines of his quarters. Once, I heard what might have been a suppressed oath, though Napoleon rarely allowed himself such lapses. When he finally called me back, the strategic situation had changed. The original plan called for our forces to continue eastward toward Vienna, maintaining pressure on the retreating Austrian army. But now, spread across his table, I saw modifications that would alter everything. Red ink marked new troop movements, revised timetables, altered objectives. The most significant change concerned Marshal Davout's Third Corps. Originally positioned to pursue the Austrians directly, Davout was now to swing south toward Bratislava, then wheel back north. This maneuver would take nearly a week longer than the original plan, but it would also keep his corps closer to France and to the communications routes that led back to Paris. When I questioned the wisdom of this delay, as was my duty as his aide, Napoleon's explanation was masterful in its strategic logic. He spoke of drawing the Austrians into a trap, of making them believe we were hesitating when in fact we were consolidating our position. He mentioned the importance of securing our southern flank and maintaining better communications with our supply lines. Every reason he gave was militarily sound, even brilliant. But I had seen his face when he read that letter. I had heard the urgency in his pen strokes as he rewrote our battle plans, and I began to understand that great men are not immune to the same doubts and jealousies that plague ordinary mortals. The difference is that when an emperor feels threatened, entire armies change course. The impact of these modifications became clear in the days that followed. Davout's altered march route meant his corps would be positioned to intercept any Austrian attempt to retreat toward Hungary, yes. But it also meant his dispatch riders could reach Paris 3 days faster than originally planned. The emperor had managed to satisfy both strategic necessity and personal anxiety with a single stroke of genius. Our communications with Paris increased dramatically. Previously, Napoleon might send 1 or 2 dispatches per week to the capital. Now, barely a day passed without sealed packets heading westward. I helped prepare many of these messages myself, and while most contained routine military updates, I noticed that several were marked for delivery directly to the Empress. The weather turned cold as we advanced. October in the Austrian countryside brought morning frosts that left our breath visible in white puffs and made metal surfaces painful to touch with bare skin. The men grumbled about the revised marching orders, not understanding why we were taking what seemed like an unnecessarily circuitous route. But they followed, as soldiers do, trusting in Napoleon's strategic vision even when they could not comprehend it. I remember one particular evening, perhaps 5 days after the letter's arrival. We had made camp near a small Austrian village whose name I can no longer recall. The emperor stood outside his tent, hands clasped behind his back, staring westward. Not toward the enemy, as one might expect, but toward France. The setting sun painted the sky in shades of amber and rose, and for a moment, Napoleon Bonaparte looked not like the master of Europe, but like any man separated from the woman he loved. He noticed my approach and turned, his expression resuming its usual mask of imperial composure. But something in his eyes remained distant, vulnerable. He asked me about my own wife, a question that surprised me, as the emperor rarely inquired about his subordinates' personal lives. When I mentioned that I had no wife, having dedicated myself entirely to military service, he nodded slowly. "A soldier's life allows little room for the heart," he said quietly. "Yet, the heart makes its demands regardless." It was the closest thing to a confession I ever heard from him regarding that letter and its influence on our campaign. The Battle of Austerlitz, when it finally came on December 2nd, vindicated Napoleon's revised strategy completely. The positioning of our forces, seemingly accidental but actually the result of those October modifications, proved perfect for crushing the combined Austrian and Russian armies. Davout's Third Corps, executing their southern flanking maneuver, struck at precisely the right moment to turn what might have been a costly victory into a triumph that shattered the Third Coalition. History would record Austerlitz as Napoleon's greatest tactical masterpiece, and perhaps it was. But I knew something historians would never write, that the foundations of that victory were laid not in the cold calculation of military science, but in the warm urgency of a man responding to his wife's loneliness and his own fears of losing her. In the weeks following Austerlitz, as we occupied Vienna and dictated terms to our defeated enemies, the dispatches from Paris took on a different tone. Josephine's subsequent letters, I saw them arrive, though I never again witnessed their contents, seemed to restore Napoleon's equilibrium. The rumours that had prompted her original correspondence apparently faded, whether through her own efforts or simply the natural course of Parisian society's fickle attention. But the consequences of that single letter rippled far beyond the imperial marriage. The altered troop movements had placed French forces in positions that would prove advantageous for years to come. Our control of the Danube Valley, established partly through Davout's modified march route, became a cornerstone of French influence in Central Europe. Strategic decisions made in response to personal jealousy became the foundation for diplomatic victories that would last until 1809. The Austrian officers we captured after Austerlitz spoke with grudging admiration of Napoleon's apparent prescience in positioning his forces. They believed he had somehow anticipated their every move, when in fact his greatest strategic inspiration had come not from military intelligence, but from the scented pages of his wife's letter. They analysed our troop dispositions for hidden meanings, never imagining that the true explanation lay in the simple human need to stay connected to home and heart. Years later, during the long exile on St. Helena, I sometimes wondered if Napoleon ever reflected on that October night when love and war intersected on his campaign table. Did he remember how personal fears had shaped strategic decisions that changed the map of Europe? Did he understand that his greatest victory had roots not only in military genius, but in the timeless vulnerability of a man who feared losing the woman he loved? The irony was not lost on me that Josephine herself would ultimately be set aside for reasons of state, divorced so that Napoleon could marry Marie-Louise of Austria and secure an heir. The very empire he had expanded partly to ease his concerns about her faithfulness would eventually demand her sacrifice. But that tragedy lay still in the future during those October days of 1805, when all seemed possible and love could redirect armies. I learned something fundamental about power during that campaign, that great men are not exempt from small concerns, and that history's grand movements sometimes spring from the most intimate sources. Napoleon's ability to transform personal anxiety into strategic advantage marked him as a leader of genius, but it also revealed him as utterly human. The letter that changed a war plan showed me that even emperors are, at heart, simply men who worry about the women they love. As I write these words in the quiet of my country retreat, I can still feel the texture of that cream-colored paper beneath my fingers. I can still see Napoleon's face in the lamplight as he absorbed news that threatened not his empire, but his happiness. And I understand now, with the clarity that comes only with age, that I witnessed one of those rare moments when private emotion and public destiny converge to reshape the world. The Grande Armée marched eastward that autumn, believing they followed Napoleon's strategic vision. They were right, but not in the way they imagined. They followed a plan born not from cold military calculation, but from the warm urgency of love threatened and jealousy awakened. They marched toward Austerlitz, carrying in their ranks the consequences of a single letter, the weight of one man's fear of losing the woman who held his heart. History judges Napoleon by his victories and defeats, his conquests and his codes. But I remember him as he was in that October tent, reading words that made him suddenly vulnerable, then transforming that vulnerability into the strategic genius that would define an era. The letter that changed a war plan changed far more than that. It revealed the man within the emperor and showed me that the greatest forces in history sometimes spring from the smallest, most human concerns. The oil lamp flickers as I finish writing these words. Outside my window, the French countryside sleeps under autumn stars, peaceful now, as it was not in those days when armies marched and empires rose and fell according to the whims of great men and the letters of lonely women. But memory preserves what history forgets. That behind every grand campaign, every strategic masterpiece, there often lies something as simple and as profound as love's fragile demands upon the human heart. That letter, cream-coloured, lavender-scented, heavy with implications and light with feminine script, altered not just battle plans, but the very trajectory of European politics. It stands as proof that in the affairs of nations, as in the affairs of the heart, the smallest gestures can have the greatest consequences. And perhaps that is the most important lesson I learned in all my years of service, that we are all, generals and privates alike, at the mercy of forces larger than ourselves: love, fear, hope, jealousy, that move through our lives like invisible armies, reshaping everything they touch. When Napoleon's empire finally fell, when the eagles were furled and the Grande Armée scattered to the winds, I kept one memento of those glorious and terrible days. Not a medal or a sword, but a small piece of cream-colored paper, a fragment of the envelope that had contained Josephine's letter. Sometimes, in the quiet evening hours, I hold it to the light and remember the night when love changed the course of war, when a woman's loneliness redirected history, and when I learned that even emperors are, in the end, merely men who carry their hearts into battle alongside their swords. The autumn of 1805 taught me that great events often have humble origins, that the fate of nations can turn on something as fragile as a marriage, as powerful as jealousy, as enduring as love. I was privileged to witness one such turning point, to see the moment when personal emotion became historical force, when private letter became public consequence. And now, as my own story nears its end, I am grateful for that glimpse behind the curtain of power, that reminder that even the greatest among us remain, at heart, beautifully and dangerously human. The letter that changed a war plan changed everything: armies, borders, dynasties, and the man who read it by lamplight in an Austrian field 42 years ago, when the world was young and anything seemed possible for those bold enough to seize it. In the end, perhaps that is Napoleon's truest legacy, not just his victories or his codes, but his demonstration that extraordinary power need not divorce us from ordinary humanity. He remained, despite everything, a man capable of love and jealousy, fear and hope, emotions that could redirect armies and reshape continents. The letter proved it, and I was there to see it happen. Such is the privilege and burden of those who serve in the shadows of great men. We alone know how small concerns become large consequences, how private fears become public victories, how a simple letter on cream-coloured paper can change the world. The weeks that followed Austerlitz brought a curious transformation in the emperor's demeanour. Where once he had been restless, constantly checking dispatches from Paris with barely concealed anxiety, he now seemed to settle into a rhythm of confident command. The victory had validated his modified strategy so completely that even the most senior marshals spoke of his prescience with something approaching awe. I remember Marshal Soult approaching Napoleon 3 days after the battle, as we established our headquarters in the Schönbrunn Palace. The Austrian imperial residence, with its gilded halls and crystal chandeliers, seemed almost absurdly opulent after months of canvas tents and campaign furniture. Soult, still bearing the mud of battle on his boots, stood before Napoleon like a supplicant before an oracle. "Sire," he said, his voice carrying the weight of genuine wonder, "your positioning of Davout's corps was nothing short of prophetic. How did you know the Austrians would attempt their flanking manoeuvre precisely where they did?" Napoleon's response was characteristic in its confident ambiguity. He spoke of reading the enemy's intentions, of understanding their desperation, of anticipating their mistakes. Every word was technically accurate, yet none revealed the true source of his inspiration. I watched from my position near the great windows, remembering that October night when love's anxiety had redrawn our battle plans. But there were moments when the mask slipped, when the man showed through the emperor's facade. I witnessed one such moment during our occupation of Vienna, when Napoleon stood in the very rooms where Austrian emperors had once planned their own campaigns against France. He had dismissed his other aides and stood alone before a massive portrait of Maria Theresa, the Austrian empress who had ruled for 40 years with wisdom and strength. She managed to hold her empire together through 7 wars, he said quietly, not turning to acknowledge my presence, but somehow knowing I was there. 7 wars, and she never lost the love of her people or her husband. The comment struck me as unusually personal, even vulnerable. Here was the conqueror of Austria, standing in the enemy's palace, yet his thoughts turned not to military triumph, but to the challenge of balancing power with personal happiness. The letter's influence, I realized, extended far beyond tactical modifications. It had awakened in Napoleon a deeper understanding of the costs that came with supreme power. The dispatches from Paris during those Vienna weeks brought news that gradually restored Napoleon's equilibrium. Josephine's letters, I could recognize her handwriting even from across a room, arrived with increasing frequency, and their effect on the emperor was unmistakable. The tension that had marked his movements since October began to ease. His laughter returned, genuine and frequent. The man who had seemed almost haunted by personal doubts began to resemble once again the confident leader who had swept across Europe. Yet I noticed new habits forming, small changes that spoke to lessons learned during those anxious autumn weeks. Napoleon began dedicating specific hours each day to personal correspondence, treating his letters to Joséphine with the same systematic attention he gave to military dispatches. He established regular courier rotations between our headquarters and Paris, ensuring that communication would never again be left to chance or the vagaries of campaign logistics. More significantly, I observed changes in how he approached strategic planning itself. The emperor had always been brilliant at seeing the broad scope of military operations, but now he seemed more attuned to the human elements that could influence outcomes. He spent more time with his marshals individually, inquiring not just about troop dispositions and supply lines, but about their personal concerns, their families, their morale. This attention to human factors would prove invaluable in the campaigns to come. The loyalty Napoleon inspired in his officers during those post-Austerlitz weeks created bonds that would hold the Grande Armée together through the hardships of Prussia, Poland, and Spain. Men fought not just for glory or conquest, but for a leader who had shown himself capable of understanding their fears and hopes. The irony of this transformation was not lost on me. Napoleon's temporary vulnerability, his response to Josephine's letter, and the personal crisis it represented, had ultimately made him a stronger commander. By acknowledging his own human concerns, he had learned to better address the human concerns of others. The emperor, who had once seemed almost mechanically perfect in his strategic calculations, now showed a deeper wisdom born from personal experience of doubt and recovery. I saw this new dimension of his leadership most clearly during our negotiations with the defeated Austrians. Emperor Francis I arrived at Schönbrunn in December, a broken man seeking terms from the conqueror of his armies. The formal ceremonies were conducted with all appropriate pomp, but it was during the private meetings that Napoleon's evolved understanding of human nature showed most clearly. Where once he might have pressed his advantage ruthlessly, demanding maximum concessions from a defeated enemy, Napoleon now showed a subtle appreciation for the Austrian emperor's position. He understood, perhaps for the first time, what it meant to fear losing something precious, in Francis's case, his dynasty and his people's welfare. The terms ultimately agreed upon were harsh enough to secure French interests, but not so crushing as to make reconciliation impossible. This balance between strength and mercy would characterize much of Napoleon's diplomacy in the years following Austerlitz. He had learned that total humiliation of enemies often bred future conflicts, while measured generosity could create the foundation for lasting peace. The personal crisis prompted by Josephine's letter had taught him that even defeated opponents remained human beings with their own fears and hopes. The winter of 1805 to 1806 passed in this atmosphere of triumph, tempered with newfound wisdom. We remained in Austria through the coldest months, consolidating our victory and negotiating the various treaties that would reshape the map of Europe. The Palace of Schönbrunn became the center of a new continental order, with diplomats from across Europe seeking audience with the French Emperor. During these months, I had occasion to observe Napoleon in his role as not just military commander, but as architect of a new European system. The confidence gained from Austerlitz, combined with the personal growth that had emerged from his October crisis, made him particularly effective in these negotiations. He could be imperious when necessary, but also showed an intuitive understanding of when to offer compromise, when to extend mercy, when to appeal to shared interests rather than simple dominance. I remember one evening in February 1806, when Napoleon was reviewing the final terms of the Treaty of Pressburg with his diplomatic advisors. The document would officially end the Third Coalition and establish French hegemony over much of Central Europe. As he signed his name to this historic agreement, he paused and looked up at me. "Major de la Croix," he said. I had been promoted following Austerlitz. "Do you remember that night in October when I asked you to leave me alone with my correspondence?" I nodded, uncertain where this conversation might lead. I have been thinking about that evening, and I realize now that it marked a turning point, not just in our campaign, but in my understanding of command itself. A general who cannot acknowledge his own humanity cannot truly understand the humanity of those he leads. It was the closest Napoleon ever came to directly acknowledging the role that Josephine's letter had played in reshaping both his strategy and his character. But I understood the deeper meaning of his words. The crisis that had seemed so potentially damaging at the time had actually opened new dimensions of leadership that would serve him well in the challenges ahead. The spring of 1806 brought new campaigns. Prussia would soon feel the weight of French arms, but also brought a changed Napoleon. The man who rode north toward new conquests carried with him lessons learned in an Austrian tent on an October night, when personal fear had collided with military responsibility. He had discovered that acknowledging vulnerability could become a source of strength, that understanding his own heart could help him better understand the hearts of others. As I packed my campaign gear for the march into Prussia, I found myself reflecting on the strange alchemy by which private emotion had been transformed into public wisdom. Josephine's letter, written in loneliness and dispatched in hope, had become the catalyst for developments far beyond anything its author could have imagined. A wife's concern about rumors and rivals had evolved into strategic insights that would influence European politics for decades. The fragment of cream-colored paper I carried with me, my memento of that pivotal night, had become more than just a sentimental keepsake. It represented proof that great leaders are not those who suppress their humanity in service of power, but those who learn to integrate their personal experiences into their public responsibilities. Napoleon's genius lay not in his ability to separate emotion from strategy, but in his capacity to transform emotional insight into strategic advantage. The campaigns that followed, Jena, Austerlitz, Wagram, would see Napoleon at the height of his powers, commanding not just through tactical brilliance, but through a deeper understanding of human nature gained during that autumn crisis of 1805. The letter that had once threatened to distract him from military concerns had instead taught him that the most effective leadership springs from authentic human understanding. And so the story of Josephine's letter becomes something larger than the tale of one woman's loneliness or one man's jealousy. It becomes a meditation on the nature of power itself, on the relationship between private emotion and public responsibility, on the way that personal crisis can become the foundation for professional growth. In the end, perhaps that is why this memory has stayed with me across the decades. Not because it revealed Napoleon's weaknesses, but because it showed how those very weaknesses, honestly confronted and thoughtfully integrated, became sources of unprecedented strength. The Prussian campaign of 1806 would test these lessons in ways none of us could have anticipated. As we marched north from our winter quarters, leaving behind the gilded halls of Schönbrunn for the muddy roads of Saxony, I carried with me not just my usual campaign equipment, but a growing awareness of how profoundly that October letter had altered the man I served. The Prussian army we faced was considered the finest in Europe, the inheritors of Frederick the Great's military tradition, disciplined and confident in their superiority over what they dismissively called the Corsican upstart and his revolutionary rabble. King Frederick William III and Queen Louise had spent months building a coalition against France, convinced that Prussian steel would succeed where Austrian and Russian arms had failed. But they faced a Napoleon transformed by personal crisis into something more formidable than the mere tactical genius who had conquered Italy. The man who planned the campaign against Prussia possessed not only his familiar strategic brilliance, but also a deeper understanding of human motivation that made him almost uncannily effective at predicting enemy movements. I witnessed this evolution most clearly during our war councils in the weeks leading up to Jena. Napoleon would spread the maps across whatever table was available, sometimes rough planks in a peasant's cottage, sometimes polished mahogany in commandeered manor houses, and discuss not just Prussian troop positions, but Prussian psychology. He spoke with insight about King Frederick William's indecision, Queen Louise's fierce patriotism, and the overconfidence that would drive Prussian commanders to seek battle before they were truly ready. "They will attack us too soon," he predicted during one such council in early October 1806, almost exactly a year after receiving Josephine's fateful letter. Their pride will not allow them to wait for better positioning or favorable conditions. They believe their reputation alone will carry the day. Marshal Lannes, veteran of a dozen campaigns, raised an eyebrow at this assessment. "Sire, the Prussians have shown admirable patience in building their coalition. Why should they abandon caution now?" Napoleon's smile carried a weight of hard-won wisdom. Because, my dear Lannis, I have learned that men in positions of great responsibility often make their gravest errors when they feel their authority questioned. The Prussians have spent months listening to criticism of their inaction. They will seek battle not because strategy demands it, but because their pride requires it. The accuracy of this prediction would soon astound us all. But at the time, I was struck by how Napoleon's analysis went beyond mere military calculation to encompass the psychological pressures that drive leaders to make fatal decisions. The man who had once felt his own authority threatened by rumors in Parisian salons now possessed an intuitive understanding of how similar pressures might affect enemy commanders. The twin battles of Jena and Auerstedt on October 14, 1806, validated Napoleon's psychological insights as completely as Austerlitz had validated his tactical modifications. The Prussian army, driven by pride and impatience rather than strategic necessity, allowed itself to be caught divided and defeated in detail. What should have been a coordinated campaign became a series of isolated disasters as Prussian commanders, each seeking individual glory, attacked piecemeal against concentrated French forces. I was with Napoleon during the fighting at Jena, positioned on the heights overlooking the battlefield as our artillery carved gaps in the advancing Prussian columns. The Emperor stood calmly amid the chaos of battle, occasionally issuing orders, but more often simply observing the unfolding destruction of Prussia's military reputation. His composure in combat had always been remarkable, but now it seemed rooted in something deeper than mere courage. A kind of philosophical acceptance of the violent necessities of power. During a brief lull in the fighting, as our cavalry pursued fleeing Prussian infantry across the autumn fields, Napoleon turned to me with an expression I had learned to recognize. It was the look he wore when connecting present events to larger patterns, when seeing in immediate tactical success the confirmation of broader strategic principles. "Do you know what decided this battle, Colonel?" he asked, using the rank I had earned after Austerlitz. "It was not our superior artillery or the courage of our infantry. It was the Prussian king's fear of appearing weak before his queen." I must have looked puzzled because Napoleon continued his explanation in the patient tone he used when teaching important lessons. "Frederick William is a decent man, but he lacks the ruthless clarity that command requires. His queen, however, burns with the fire of patriotism and has made no secret of her desire for war with France. The king finds himself caught between his strategic instincts, which counsel patience, and his domestic situation, which demands action. In the end, personal considerations outweighed military wisdom. The parallel to his own situation the previous year was unmistakable, though Napoleon did not make it explicit. He had learned through personal experience how private pressures could distort strategic judgment, and this knowledge now allowed him to anticipate and exploit similar vulnerabilities in his enemies. The collapse of Prussian resistance following Jena-Auerstedt was more complete than anyone had dared hope. Within weeks, we occupied Berlin itself, and I found myself once again quartered in an enemy capital, watching Napoleon transform military victory into political advantage. The speed of our conquest had been breathtaking, from the opening of hostilities to the occupation of the Prussian capital in less than a month. But it was during the occupation of Berlin that I observed the most profound evidence of how that October letter had changed Napoleon's approach to conquest. Where once he might have imposed harsh terms purely to demonstrate French power, he now showed a more nuanced understanding of when mercy might serve better than severity. The Prussian royal family had fled to East Prussia, leaving Berlin in the hands of French administrators. Napoleon established his headquarters in the Stadtschloss, the Baroque palace of Prussian kings, and from those ornate rooms began the delicate work of restructuring Central European politics. The challenge was complex. How to punish Prussian aggression without destroying Prussia entirely? How to demonstrate French supremacy without creating permanent enemies? How to balance the demands of French security with the realities of European stability? I watched Napoleon navigate these challenges with a sophistication that seemed to draw directly from his personal experiences of the previous year. He understood now, in ways that perhaps no previous conqueror had, that lasting political arrangements must account for human pride and dignity, as well as strategic necessities. The man who had felt his own authority threatened by whispered rumors now showed remarkable sensitivity to the wounded pride of his defeated enemies. This sensitivity manifested in unexpected ways. When dealing with Prussian civilians, Napoleon insisted on correct behavior from French troops and personally intervened to prevent the kind of wholesale looting that had traditionally accompanied military occupation. When negotiating with Prussian officials who remained in Berlin, he showed respect for their positions, even as he fundamentally altered their authority. Most significantly, he refrained from the kind of deliberate humiliation that might have satisfied French pride, but would have made future reconciliation impossible. The wisdom of this approach became clear during the months that followed. Prussian resistance, which might have continued indefinitely if driven by pure desperation, instead gradually transformed into grudging acceptance of French hegemony. The population of Berlin, expecting the worst from their conquerors, found themselves dealing with an occupying power that, while certainly dominant, showed unexpected restraint in exercising that dominance. I remember one evening in November 1806, as the first snows began to dust the streets of Berlin, when Napoleon stood at the windows of the Stadtschloss, looking out over the conquered city. The lights of ordinary citizens going about their evening routines twinkled in the darkness, a reminder that empires rise and fall, but human life continues with its modest concerns and simple hopes. Power, Napoleon said quietly, perhaps speaking more to himself than to me, is not proved by the ability to destroy, but by the wisdom to know when destruction serves no purpose. It was a remarkable statement from a man who had just demolished the military reputation of Prussia in a matter of weeks. But I understood its source. The personal crisis of the previous year had taught Napoleon that true strength sometimes requires acknowledging weakness, that lasting authority must be built on something more substantial than fear alone. The Treaty of Tilsit, signed the following summer after our campaigns against Russia, would represent the full flowering of this evolved understanding of power. In those negotiations with Tsar Alexander I, conducted on a raft in the middle of the Niemen River, Napoleon demonstrated his mastery not just of military strategy, but of psychological diplomacy. He understood that Alexander, like any ruler, needed to preserve his dignity even in defeat, and structured their agreement to allow both emperors to claim victory while securing French strategic objectives. But that summer still lay in the future as we settled into our winter quarters in Berlin. The immediate aftermath of Jena Auerstedt provided me with daily opportunities to observe how Napoleon's character had been shaped by his encounter with personal vulnerability. The emperor, who had once seemed almost mechanically perfect in his strategic calculations, now showed a more complex understanding of the human elements that determine political outcomes. This evolution was perhaps most visible in his correspondence during the Berlin occupation. The systematic attention to personal letters that had begun after receiving Josephine's troubling news continued and indeed intensified. Napoleon now maintained regular communication not just with his wife, but with a wide network of family members, political allies, and trusted subordinates scattered across his growing empire. He had learned that maintaining personal connections required the same systematic approach as maintaining supply lines or intelligence networks. The quality of these communications also reflected his growth as a leader, where once his letters had been primarily functional, conveying orders, requesting information, announcing decisions, they now showed greater attention to the emotional and psychological needs of their recipients. Napoleon had discovered that effective leadership required not just the ability to command obedience, but the skill to inspire genuine loyalty. And genuine loyalty springs from understanding and addressing the whole person, not just their professional function. I saw this understanding applied to great effect in his dealings with the marshals and generals who had followed him from victory to victory across Europe. Men like Murat, Ney, and Davout were not just military instruments to be deployed according to strategic necessity. They were individuals with their own ambitions, fears, and personal concerns that could influence their effectiveness as commanders. Napoleon's growing sensitivity to these human factors made him increasingly effective at getting the best performance from his subordinates. The winter months in Berlin also provided time for reflection on the broader implications of the campaign we had just completed. The destruction of Prussian military power represented more than just another French victory. It marked the effective end of the old European balance of power that had existed since the Treaty of Westphalia. French armies now dominated the continent from the Atlantic to the Vistula, and Napoleon found himself in the position of architecting an entirely new international system. The responsibilities that came with such unprecedented power might have overwhelmed a lesser man, but Napoleon approached them with the confidence of someone who had learned to integrate personal experience with professional responsibility. The crisis that had once threatened to distract him from military concerns had instead taught him that the most effective leadership springs from authentic human understanding, and this lesson now served him well as he grappled with challenges no previous ruler had faced. As 1806 drew to a close and we prepared for what would become the campaign against Russia, I found myself thinking often about that cream-colored letter that had started such an extraordinary chain of consequences. Josephine's expression of loneliness and anxiety, written in the intimate chambers of Malmaison and carried across hundreds of miles by exhausted couriers, had become the catalyst for developments that were reshaping the entire European continent. The fragment of that letter's envelope, still carefully preserved among my personal effects, had become something more than a memento. It represented proof that the greatest forces in history often spring from the most human sources, that private emotion and public destiny are more closely intertwined than we typically acknowledge. In keeping that small piece of cream-colored paper, I preserved not just a memory, but a lesson about the nature of power itself. The Russian campaign of 1812 would test every lesson Napoleon had learned about the relationship between personal emotion and strategic wisdom. By then, I had been promoted to full colonel and served as one of his most trusted staff officers, privy to the intimate deliberations that shaped the fate of nations. As we prepared for what would become the most ambitious military undertaking in history, I watched the emperor grapple with decisions that would determine not just the outcome of a single campaign, but the survival of his empire. The origins of the conflict with Russia lay partly in the deteriorating relationship between Napoleon and Tsar Alexander, two men who had once embraced as brothers on that raft at Tilsit, but whose alliance had gradually soured under the pressures of competing interests and wounded pride. Yet as I observed the emperor during those months of preparation, I sensed that deeper, more personal forces were also at work. Joséphine had been divorced and sent away in 1809, replaced by the young Austrian Archduchess Marie-Louise, in a marriage designed to secure the succession and cement an alliance with Austria. The political logic of this decision was unassailable, but its emotional cost had been higher than Napoleon anticipated. The man who had once been driven to strategic genius by jealous love now seemed motivated by a different kind of emotional urgency. The need to prove that his sacrifice of personal happiness had been worthwhile. I remember a conversation from March 1812, as the Grande Armée assembled on the banks of the Vistula. Napoleon had been reviewing intelligence reports about Russian preparations when he suddenly set aside the papers and stared into the distance. The headquarters was located in a Polish mansion whose previous owners had fled, leaving behind portraits of ancestors who gazed down with aristocratic disapproval at these French interlopers. "Do you think, Colonel," Napoleon asked without preamble, "that a man can make himself happy through the pursuit of glory alone?" The question startled me both by its philosophical nature and by its obvious personal significance. This was the emperor asking not about military strategy or political necessity, but about the fundamental choices that had shaped his life. I offered some conventional response about duty and sacrifice, but Napoleon waved it aside with visible impatience. "I divorced the woman I loved to marry a girl young enough to be my daughter," he said bluntly. "I did it for France, for the dynasty, for the future. But sometimes I wonder if I traded away the thing that made victory meaningful in pursuit of victories that have no meaning." It was an extraordinary admission from a man who had conquered most of Europe, and it revealed the psychological landscape in which the Russian campaign took shape. Napoleon's decision to invade Russia was driven by legitimate strategic concerns: the breakdown of the continental system, Russian violations of the Tilsit agreements, the need to maintain French hegemony in Europe. But underneath these rational calculations lay something more personal: the desperate need to justify through one final decisive triumph the personal sacrifices that had brought him to this pinnacle of power. The scale of our preparations was unlike anything I had witnessed in previous campaigns. By spring 1812, nearly 600,000 men had assembled under French command. Not just French troops, but soldiers from across Napoleon's empire and allied states. Germans, Poles, Italians, Dutch, and a dozen other nationalities had been swept into this great military machine designed to bring Russia to its knees. Yet as I watched Napoleon review these vast formations during the ceremonies that preceded our crossing of the Niemen, I sensed something had changed in his relationship with his army. The easy camaraderie that had once existed between the emperor and his soldiers seemed strained. These men knew they were embarking on something unprecedented in its ambition and risk, and their enthusiasm seemed forced, dutiful, rather than spontaneous. Napoleon himself appeared aware of this subtle shift in morale. During one of his traditional pre-battle addresses to the troops, I noticed how he worked harder than usual to generate the kind of fervent response that had once come automatically. The magic was still there, but it required more effort now, as if both commander and commanded understood they were being asked to stake everything on a single, colossal gamble. The crossing of the Niemen on June 24, 1812, marked the beginning of the end of Napoleon's empire, though none of us realized it at the time. As our endless columns of infantry, cavalry, and artillery streamed across the river into Russian territory, the emperor rode among them with every appearance of confidence. But I had learned to read the subtle signs of his inner state, and I could detect beneath his public composure a tension that reminded me of those anxious October days 7 years earlier. The early weeks of the campaign seemed to validate Napoleon's strategic vision. Russian forces retreated before our advance, avoiding the decisive battle that might have ended the war quickly. Our armies pushed deeper into the vast Russian interior, capturing cities and provinces with methodical efficiency. Yet with each mile we advanced, I sensed the emperor's growing unease with the nature of this conquest. Unlike previous campaigns, where victory had brought tangible rewards, captured treasures, grateful populations, strategic advantages that could be consolidated into lasting gains, the Russian campaign offered only empty space and sullen inhabitants who had been systematically evacuated ahead of our advance. We were conquering a landscape that had been deliberately stripped of everything that makes conquest worthwhile. This realization seemed to affect Napoleon more deeply than purely military setbacks would have. The man who had learned to find personal meaning in strategic triumph now found himself pursuing victories that felt increasingly hollow. The cities we captured were empty shells. The territory we controlled was a burden rather than an asset. The enemy we sought to defeat remained perpetually out of reach. I witnessed the full psychological impact of this frustration during our occupation of Moscow in September 1812. Napoleon had finally achieved his strategic objective, the capture of Russia's ancient capital, only to discover that it was a Pyrrhic victory of the most devastating kind. The city had been abandoned by its population and systematically set ablaze, leaving us masters of a burning wasteland. The emperor established his headquarters in the Kremlin, that fortress palace of Russian tsars, and there I watched him confront the failure of everything he had believed about the nature of power and conquest. For 3 weeks, we waited in Moscow for a Russian surrender that never came, while the city burned around us and winter approached with inexorable certainty. It was during those terrible September days that Napoleon's thoughts turned most frequently to the past. I found him one evening in the Kremlin's imperial apartments, staring at a portrait of Catherine the Great, another foreign-born ruler who had transformed herself into the embodiment of Russian power. The irony was not lost on him that he, who had conquered most of Europe, now found himself trapped in the palace of a dead empress whose empire refused to acknowledge his victory. "I should have listened to my heart," he said quietly, his voice carrying a weight of exhaustion I had never heard before. A man who sacrifices love for ambition may find that neither brings him happiness. The reference to Josephine was unmistakable, though he did not speak her name. Standing in that abandoned palace, surrounded by the detritus of Russian imperial power, Napoleon seemed to understand finally that his pursuit of ever greater conquests had led him away from everything that had once made victory meaningful. The retreat from Moscow began on October 19th, 1812, almost exactly 7 years after that letter from Josephine had arrived to reshape our Austrian campaign. But where that earlier moment had marked the beginning of Napoleon's strategic evolution, this October represented the beginning of his empire's dissolution. I had participated in retreats before: the withdrawal from Acre in 1799, the evacuation of Egypt, various tactical withdrawals during the early Italian campaigns. But nothing had prepared me for the systematic destruction of the Grande Armée during those nightmarish weeks as we struggled back toward the Niemen through the onset of Russian winter. The Emperor's behavior during the retreat revealed the full extent of his transformation since those days when personal crisis had made him a more effective leader. Now, faced with the collapse of everything he had built, Napoleon showed a kind of stoic dignity that drew on reserves of character forged through years of understanding his own humanity. He shared the hardships of his men, walking when horses were needed for the wounded, eating the same meager rations as common soldiers, sleeping in the same inadequate shelters as everyone else. The man who had once lived in imperial palaces now accepted the most basic conditions with a grace that inspired devotion even in the midst of disaster. Yet I could see that the retreat was more than just a military catastrophe for Napoleon. It was a confrontation with the consequences of choices made years earlier. The personal sacrifices he had accepted in pursuit of glory now seemed to mock him as that glory crumbled in the Russian snow. The empire he had built at the cost of his personal happiness was dissolving, leaving him with neither power nor love. I remember one particularly bitter night near Smolensk when our small group of survivors huddled around a meager fire built from the wreckage of military wagons. Napoleon sat apart from the others, wrapped in a tattered grey coat that bore no resemblance to his usual imperial regalia. In the flickering firelight, he looked not like the master of Europe, but like any exhausted middle-aged man confronting the ruins of his life's work. "Do you know what I regret most, Colonel?" he asked, his voice barely audible above the wind. "Not the battles lost or the territories abandoned. I regret the letters I never wrote, the conversations I never had, the simple human connections I sacrificed for the sake of grand strategies that led to this." It was a devastating admission from a man who had once believed that personal happiness was a luxury he could not afford. The retreat from Russia had stripped away all pretense, revealing the fundamental truth that power without human connection is ultimately meaningless. The fragment of Josephine's letter that I still carried had become more precious during those terrible weeks. As we struggled through the snow and ice, pursued by Cossacks, and harassed by partisan attacks, that small piece of cream-colored paper represented something the Russian winter could not destroy. Proof that there had once been a time when love and strategy had worked together to create something beautiful and effective. By the time we recrossed the Niemen in December 1812, the Grande Armée had effectively ceased to exist. Of the 600,000 men who had entered Russia with such confidence, fewer than 30,000 remained in fighting condition. The rest had been claimed by battle, disease, cold, and desertion, the price of an ambition that had overreached its foundations. Napoleon himself survived, as did I and a handful of other staff officers. But we carried with us the knowledge that we had witnessed the end of an era. The empire that had seemed so permanent just months earlier now revealed itself to have been built on the shifting sands of military success and personal will. When those foundations crumbled, everything built upon them collapsed with terrifying speed. The campaigns of 1813 and 1814 would be fought by Napoleon, transformed yet again by catastrophe. The man who had once learned wisdom from personal crisis now drew on deeper reserves of character forged in the crucible of absolute defeat. He showed flashes of his old genius during those final struggles against the coalition. Brilliant victories at Lutzen, Bautzen, and Dresden that reminded the world why he had once been considered invincible. But these successes could not reverse the fundamental shift in European power that had begun with the Russian disaster. The empire was dying, and no amount of tactical brilliance could restore what had been lost in the snows of Moscow and the retreat to the Niemen. I remained with Napoleon through the abdication at Fontainebleau in April 1814, watching as he signed away an empire in exchange for sovereignty over the tiny island of Elba. It was a scene of almost unbearable pathos, the conqueror of Europe reduced to ruling a Mediterranean speck barely large enough to accommodate his ambitions. Yet even in defeat, Napoleon showed the wisdom he had gained through decades of confronting his own humanity. His farewell to the old guard, those veterans who had followed him through triumph and disaster, demonstrated an understanding of human dignity that might have seemed impossible in the young general who had first emerged from the chaos of revolution. The 100 Days would provide one final glimpse of Napoleon's genius, but Waterloo marked the definitive end of his active career. I was not present for that last battle, having been captured during the German campaign of 1813, but I learned of its outcome from fellow prisoners in Austrian custody. The news brought not surprise, but a kind of sorrowful recognition that the story begun with such promise had reached its inevitable conclusion. When I finally returned to France after the peace, I found a country transformed by 2 decades of almost constant warfare. The revolutionary fervour that had first brought Napoleon to power had long since been exhausted, replaced by a weary desire for stability and peace. The people who had once cheered his victories now welcomed the return of the Bourbons with relief rather than enthusiasm. I visited Malmaison in the autumn of 1815, shortly after Napoleon's final exile to St. Helena. The chateau where Joséphine had once held court stood empty and neglected, its gardens overgrown and its rooms stripped of their former splendour. Josephine herself had passed away the previous year, spared the pain of witnessing her former husband's final defeat. Standing in the salon where she had once received visitors from across Europe, I thought about the letter that had started such an extraordinary chain of consequences. That expression of loneliness and anxiety, written in these very rooms, had become the catalyst for strategic insights that had reshaped a continent. The personal crisis it represented had taught Napoleon lessons about leadership that had served him well for nearly a decade, until ambition finally overwhelmed wisdom and led to catastrophe. Yet even in failure, those lessons retained their value. The Napoleon who faced defeat and exile did so with a dignity that drew on his hard-won understanding of human nature. The man who had once learned to integrate personal emotion with strategic thinking now applied that same integration to the challenge of accepting loss while maintaining his essential character. The years that followed Napoleon's final exile passed with the peculiar weight that settles over a world suddenly deprived of its central figure. Europe, which had organized itself for 2 decades around the necessity of either supporting or opposing French hegemony, now found itself adrift in an unfamiliar peace. The Congress of Vienna had redrawn the map with meticulous care, but maps cannot capture the psychological void left by the absence of a man who had seemed to embody history itself. I retired from active service in 1816, accepting a modest pension and the quiet dignity that comes with survival. My estate at Saint-Germain became my refuge from a world that no longer seemed to require the particular skills I had spent my life developing. The arts of war and diplomacy that had once determined the fate of nations now appeared as obsolete as medieval tournament skills in an age of industrial progress. Yet retirement provided me with something more valuable than activity: the opportunity for reflection. As the immediate pressures of military life receded, I found myself thinking more frequently about those pivotal moments when individual choices had shaped historical outcomes. The memory of that October night in 1805 returned again and again, not as mere nostalgia, but as a lens through which to understand the deeper patterns of power and personality that govern human affairs. News of Napoleon's condition on St. Helena filtered back to France through various channels: official reports from British administrators, letters from the few companions allowed to share his exile, rumours carried by sailors and merchants who had glimpsed the fallen emperor during his carefully supervised walks around that remote island. The picture that emerged was both tragic and oddly inspiring. A man reduced to the most basic circumstances, yet somehow retaining the intellectual vitality that had once commanded armies and reshaped continents. I learned that Napoleon spent his exile writing not just the memoirs that would eventually reshape his historical reputation, but extensive correspondence with friends and family members scattered across Europe. The systematic attention to personal relationships that had begun after receiving Josephine's letter continued even in defeat, as if he had finally understood that human connections were the only form of wealth that could not be confiscated by victorious enemies. The irony was profound. The man who had once sacrificed personal happiness for strategic advantage now found that personal relationships were his only remaining source of meaning. The letters he wrote from St. Helena to his scattered family, his loyal servants, even former enemies who had shown him respect, represented a kind of victory over the forces that had destroyed his empire. They proved that while political power could be stripped away, the capacity for human connection endured as long as life itself. I received one such letter myself in the spring of 1820, forwarded through channels I never fully understood but suspected, involved the quiet network of former imperial officers who maintained their loyalty despite official prohibitions. The letter was brief. Napoleon's health was already declining, but it carried the unmistakable stamp of his personality. My dear Lacroix, I think often of our campaigns and the lessons they taught us about the relationship between duty and desire, strategy and humanity. You were present during some of my most important discoveries about the nature of command. And I hope you understand that those discoveries shaped not just military victories but the man who achieved them. Remember me not as the emperor who lost an empire, but as the soldier who learned that true strength comes from acknowledging our weaknesses. The letter was unsigned, a precaution against British censorship, but I needed no signature to recognize its author. Here was the same voice that had once dictated orders, reshaping the map of Europe, now reduced to a few carefully chosen words that somehow captured the essence of everything we had experienced together. I kept that letter with the fragment of Josephine's original correspondence, creating a small archive of the documents that had shaped my understanding of historical causation. Together, they told a story that no official history would ever record. How private emotion had become public policy. How personal crisis had generated strategic insight. How individual growth had influenced the destiny of nations. The news of Napoleon's death on May 5th, 1821, reached France with the peculiar weight of an event both expected and shocking. Expected because reports of his declining health had circulated for months. Shocking because it marked the definitive end of an era that had defined European politics for a generation. The Corsican, who had begun his career as a junior artillery officer, had finally succumbed to the same mortality that claims emperors and peasants alike. Yet even in death, Napoleon's influence continued to shape European consciousness in ways that surprised those who had expected his legacy to die with him. The Romantic movement, which had initially opposed his imperial ambitions, now found in his exile and death a powerful symbol of individual genius destroyed by conventional forces. Poets and artists across Europe began creating works that transformed the fallen emperor into a tragic hero whose personal struggles embodied the larger human condition. This transformation of Napoleon from historical figure into cultural symbol reflected, I believe, a widespread recognition that his story contained truths about power, ambition, love, and loss that transcended mere political biography. The man who had learned to integrate personal emotion with strategic thinking had become, in death, a reminder that even the most extraordinary individuals remain subject to the fundamental dynamics of human nature. As the years passed and the immediate passions of the Napoleonic era cooled into historical memory, I found myself increasingly called upon to share my recollections with younger generations who had not witnessed those tumultuous times. University professors, military historians, and curious civilians would visit my estate, seeking first-hand accounts of battles and campaigns that had already assumed legendary status. During these conversations, I was often asked to identify the key to Napoleon's success. What quality or technique had enabled him to achieve such unprecedented military and political dominance? The question always brought my thoughts back to that October night in 1805, when a letter from Paris had transformed personal anxiety into strategic advantage? The answer I eventually learned to give was both simple and complex. Napoleon succeeded because he never stopped learning, especially about himself. His willingness to acknowledge his own vulnerabilities and integrate personal insights into professional responsibilities gave him advantages that purely technical military skill could never provide. He understood that effective leadership requires not the suppression of humanity, but its intelligent application to the challenges of command. This lesson extended far beyond military affairs. In the decades following Napoleon's death, as European society grappled with the challenges of industrialization, democratization, and social change, the leaders who proved most effective were often those who had learned similar lessons about the relationship between personal authenticity and public responsibility. The rigid authoritarianism that had characterized previous centuries gave way gradually to more flexible forms of governance that acknowledge the complexity of human motivation. I lived to see the Revolution of 1848, which brought Napoleon's nephew to power as Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, later Emperor Napoleon III. The parallels with his uncle's career were obvious but superficial. The younger Napoleon lacked both the strategic genius and the personal growth that had characterized the original. He achieved power through manipulation rather than inspiration, and his reign, while successful in material terms, never generated the kind of passionate loyalty that had sustained his uncle through triumph and disaster. Watching Napoleon III's rise and eventual fall during the Franco-Prussian War of 1870, I was struck by how completely he had missed the essential lesson of his uncle's career. He understood the techniques of power, but not its deeper dynamics. He could command obedience, but not devotion. He achieved authority, but never learned to transform personal experience into strategic wisdom. The contrast reinforced my conviction that the true significance of the original Napoleon lay not in his military victories or territorial conquests, impressive as these were, but in his demonstration that great leadership springs from the integration of personal growth with professional responsibility. The letter that had changed a war plan represented just one example of this integration, but it encapsulated principles that remained relevant long after the specific circumstances that generated it had passed into history. As I write these final pages in the autumn of 1847, Napoleon has been dead for more than a quarter century, yet his influence continues to shape European politics and culture in ways both obvious and subtle. The maps he redrew have been redrawn again. The institutions he created have been modified or abolished. The empire he built has dissolved into memory. But the lessons he learned about the relationship between private emotion and public duty retain their relevance for anyone who aspires to leadership in any sphere of human activity. The cream-coloured fragment I have preserved all these years has become more than a personal memento. It represents a tangible link to one of history's most important discoveries about the nature of power itself. That discovery, that effective leadership requires the integration of personal insight with strategic thinking, remains as vital today as it was during those October nights when a troubled emperor rewrote battle plans in response to his wife's anxious letter. I am now an old man, my hands trembling as I set down these words, my memories more vivid than my immediate surroundings. The world has changed dramatically since those days when French eagles flew from Madrid to Moscow, when Napoleon's name could inspire either devotion or terror depending on which side of a battlefield you occupied. The age of individual genius dominating continental politics has given way to more complex forms of power based on industrial capacity, popular mobilization, and technological innovation. Yet the fundamental challenges of leadership remain unchanged. Whether commanding armies or governing nations, leading businesses or inspiring social movements, human beings must still grapple with the same basic tensions between personal desire and public responsibility that Napoleon confronted during his extraordinary career. The specific circumstances change, but the underlying dynamics of character, ambition, wisdom, and weakness continue to determine outcomes in ways that technical expertise alone cannot address. The letter that changed a war plan stands as proof that history's grandest movements often spring from its most intimate sources. A woman's loneliness, transformed through her husband's strategic genius into military advantage, ultimately reshaped the political structure of an entire continent. Personal crisis became professional growth. Private anxiety became public triumph. Individual vulnerability became strategic wisdom. This transformation did not occur through the suppression of human emotion, but through its intelligent integration into the larger purposes of leadership. Napoleon's greatness lay not in his ability to rise above human concerns, but in his capacity to understand how those concerns could serve strategic objectives. He learned to make strength from weakness, wisdom from crisis, victory from the honest acknowledgement of his own fears and limitations. As I prepare to join the countless others who served in those tumultuous times, I leave behind this record not as a monument to a fallen empire, but as testimony to truths about leadership that transcend any particular historical moment. The cream-colored fragment will outlast me, as it has already outlasted the woman who wrote the letter, and the man who received it. It carries within its modest dimensions proof that the greatest forces in human affairs often arise from the smallest, most personal sources. Future generations will judge Napoleon by many criteria: his military innovations, his legal codes, his impact on European development, his role in spreading revolutionary ideals across traditional societies. But those of us who served close enough to observe the man behind the legend learned something that history books rarely capture: that his most important victory was the conquest of his own character, the transformation of personal vulnerability into strategic advantage, the integration of heart and mind in service of purposes larger than himself. The letter that changed a war plan changed everything because it revealed to Napoleon, and through him to all of us privileged to witness his transformation, that true power springs not from the denial of humanity, but from its fullest expression in service of worthy goals. That lesson, preserved in memory and recorded in these pages, represents the most enduring legacy of an extraordinary man who learned to make greatness from the honest acknowledgement of his own essential humanity. And so I end where I began, with the recognition that the most profound historical forces often have the most intimate origins. In a world that frequently mistakes cynicism for wisdom and emotional detachment for strength, the story of Napoleon and Josephine's letter serves as a reminder that the opposite is often true, that our greatest achievements spring from our deepest connections, our clearest insights from our most honest self-examination, our most enduring victories from our willingness to acknowledge and integrate the full complexity of human experience. The fragment of cream-colored paper lies before me as I write these final words, still carrying after all these years the faint scent of lavender that once marked it as distinctively hers. It reminds me that love and strategy, emotion and intellect, private concern and public responsibility need not be enemies, but can become, in the hands of someone wise enough to integrate them, the foundation for achievements that outlast the empires they create and the individuals who inspire them. Such was the lesson of that October night in 1805, when a letter changed not just a war plan, but the very understanding of what it means to lead others while remaining true to oneself. Such is the legacy I leave to those who will carry forward the eternal human struggle to balance personal authenticity with public duty, individual desire with collective responsibility, the demands of the heart with the necessities of history,